Part 2 begins to move us beyond the covers of this book. But before we get to that discussion, just a question, an important one. Jesus, Sabbath reformer, a real reformer in the area of the Sabbath?
Yeah.
In what way?
Radical.
Radical?
Well, what he did, the way that he, observed Sabbath, caused the leadership to want to put him to death. They were, this Jewish society at that time was pretty rigid in how Sabbath was to be kept, and there were quite a lot of rules that people were supposed to observe, and healing wasn't part of those rules. So when Jesus healed on the Sabbath, it was almost like an act of defiance or something, or evidently accepted that way. And he wanted to show people what Sabbath really was, and how could he do it except by showing them. And I think it was such a contrast to what was expected.
In fact, when you take the proportion of his Sabbath miracles, 7 of them recorded in the Gospels, 7. Yeah. You put that up against the other miracles, is that a low percentage or a high percentage?
Well, it's probably about a third. I mean, if you count the people, including the 10 lepers, there were about around 30 people that we know of that were actually named or referred to as specific individuals. So 7 out of those were Sabbath miracles. But it's another interesting point here is the fact that the Jewish Sabbath laws were not really, let's say, codified until, the 2nd century.
Okay.
All right? And there were these 39 categories of them, weren't there? Think about 39 categories. And in fact, some say there were 39 categories and there were 39 separate rules in each category. So you come out around 1,500, all right? The one that Jesus targeted over and over again was this mortal danger rule, which we mentioned.
Mortal danger, meaning?
Well, it was okay if somebody was hurt in an accident and their life was threatened. It was proper on Sabbath to do anything that you could.
Pull over to the side of the road
Exactly,
and help.
to help that person. But if a person was chronically ill, that person was not to be cared for in any unusual way on the Sabbath. And the worst part about it, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and you're saying that the Sabbath miracles were the chronically ill types.
Well, you look at who they were. I mean, there was the man by the pool of Bethesda.
John 5.
Yeah. How about the woman who'd been bent over for 18 years, all right? How about the man with a withered hand? They had been withered from birth. The man born blind. All right, who were these people? These were all people who were chronically ill. The thing that amazed me the most was this, that there were rabbis that taught that it was improper to pray for a sick person on the Sabbath. Because that brought the whole idea of imperfection and sickness into the Sabbath and somehow polluted it. So for Jesus to come along, Dwight, and do what he did, I mean, this was truly radical.
So he establishes himself not only as the Lord of the Sabbath, because Mark 2:28 is clear, 2:27, 28, but he establishes himself as a radical reformer of God's gift of time.
Yeah.
He personally confronts it.
And it was because he was doing these things that the Jewish leaders sought to kill him.
And he's executed on a Friday, rests on the Sabbath,
right.
honors that day.
Yeah, it's interesting too, they wanted to kill him because they said, everyone's going to follow him now. He's doing all these things and people are all going to follow him, and they'll follow him so much that we're going to go into captivity because of it. And they weren't even acknowledging that they were already under the power of Rome. They were already under the Roman yoke, and they were accusing Jesus of healing on the Sabbath and causing them to be put into greater captivity than they were.
Go ahead.
Well, Jesus makes an interesting statement about the Sabbath there in Matthew 24. He says, look, if you're going to flee, because Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, I'm going to predict this, I'm going to prophesy, Jerusalem will be destroyed, pray that your flight be not on the
Sabbath day.
Sabbath or winter or Sabbath, right?
Right.
So that still keeps us within the covers of this book, although that would be 70 A.D. Some interesting stories about the Christians, the Jewish men, women who have become followers of Christ, and they're fleeing Jerusalem. And
they were warned that there would be a sign for them to leave Jerusalem. And we understand that they left when the armies withdrew. They left, and that not one Christian lost their life in the siege of Jerusalem. And they went into Pila, in the Jordan area, and there's a lot of interesting stories surrounding that time after that.
In the
that
Jordan area?
If we don't cover.
Give me one.
Going into, well, of course, they worshipped with the Jews until, for quite a few years.
The Christians, you're talking about the followers of Christ,
right, worship with
continue
the
to
Jews.
worship with the Jewish
Then
community.
eventually they begin to have their own worship places. But we have in Syria today an area that has all these old broken down cities. They're called the silent cities of Syria. They're beautiful. They're made of beautiful blocks. They have
you been there?
My husband went there.
Wow.
I haven't gotten to go there. The buildings were built without any mortar, but they're still standing, a lot of them today. There were sanitation facilities. They were very high, a high level of civilization. And supposedly these cities were built by the Christians, and probably Sabbath-keeping Christians. We can't say that for sure, but those early Christians that had fled Jerusalem and moved into those areas, moved out along the trade routes and built these beautiful cities that showed, such a high level of civilization.
Yeah, as far as the Romans were concerned, the Christians were not, like a separate denomination.
Yeah, Rome looked at them all as the same,
Exactly.
little aberrations within the same sect.
Especially if they all worshipped on the same day. What difference is there among them?
Which leads me, Jim, to this whole issue of the Jewish revolt, the diaspora, right after the turn of the century.
Right.
Trajan.
Under Trajan.
Unpack that a little bit for us.
This takes us to around 114.
Okay.
The Jews lived not just in Palestine, but there were Jews that were living in
All over the empire.
all over the empire. Yeah, they were
Clear to
living in what is
India.
now Iraq
Persia.
and Syria, clear to India, maybe even beyond. But around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, there were Christians that lived in Cyrene, which today would be Libya, right? And in Egypt. There were lots of Jews in Cyprus. During the reign of Trajan, he took his armies into, I guess what would now be Iraq, into what was called then Parthia,
Okay.
all right? And while vast numbers of Roman troops were there, Jews in centers in Cyrene, in Egypt, and in Cyprus revolted.
Trajan goes away, then they revolt.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, they revolted, and they actually took over certain areas. And there are reports of tremendous atrocities that they committed against the non-Jews that lived in those areas. And eventually, Trajan brings part of his forces back to stem this uprising, in North Africa and in Cyprus. But all this does is serve to further inflame the animosity toward the Jews, and probably to then contribute to the growing sense within the Christians that it would be advantageous for them to be identified as something other than Jews.
Don't mix me up with them. Yeah.
Right.
Until we get to the time of Hadrian, be about 135 A.D.
Yes.
And doesn't he actually pass an imperial edict that declares Judaism religio illicita, an illegal religion?
Well, what started that whole thing, which really dates to what, 132, when the uprising began. Hadrian wanted to turn Jerusalem into a capital of paganism, and you can imagine then how the Jews would react to that, and they did. Again, just like at this earlier revolt, the diaspora revolt in 114, there was an element of a messianic element. We have a Messiah among us. Let's take over. Let's go back to Palestine and so forth. Well, this same kind of a thing happened in that revolt in 132 to 135. They came together under a leader, Bar Kokhba. He was sort of like their king, their Messiah, and there was a great deal of excitement that this is the time now when we're going to overthrow the Romans, and we'll be the great nation. And that culminated in Hadrian's edict, well, actually at that time Jews were completely banned from living in Jerusalem. Sabbath keeping was outlawed. The circumcision was outlawed. So this was a great reaction against
Which
the Jews.
further strengthens a Christian's desire to be
Separate.
unassociated.
That's
Yeah,
right.
please. So if I'm walking down the street with my Bible under my arm, and of course they didn't have Bibles back then under their arms, but if I'm walking down the street on the seventh-day Sabbath, which I've been used to doing all my life, but now it's an illegal religion, and the whole empire knows Jews worship on the Sabbath, the immediate conclusion of my neighbors is, you're one of them.
Yeah.
And so you can understand the social pressure, Pat, of just, whoa, disassociating ourselves
Yeah.
from Jews. Yeah.
Yeah, it was certainly an element in the whole.
Yeah, I mean,
Change.
well, it's a social element that's continued to this day in large parts of the world.
It's countercultural. To be a Sabbatarian today, and I'm jumping to the third millennium, but to be a Sabbatarian, and I was just reflecting on this with my congregation this last weekend at Andrews University, to be a Sabbatarian is countercultural. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand up like three sore thumbs on a plane of worshiping pagans.
Yeah.
They stand up, and Daniel 3 is clear. They are Jews,
Yeah.
Sabbatarians. It's always been countercultural to be a Sabbatarian. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
But guys, before we bid farewell to the Jews in this journey through the history of the last 2,000 years, an incredible experience that happened to you with was it a rabbi who played the part of a rabbi 2,000 years ago?
He was an actor.
Yeah, the blessing of the heretics. Okay, so he was an actor.
Yeah.
Tell us that story.
Well, it comes down to this little foundation to it. There was a blessing, actually a curse, that was added into one of the regular synagogue prayers or benedictions.
All right.
And it was actually a curse on the heretics.
Heretics meaning Christians.
Well, in this case, yes.
Okay.
Designed to sort of bring out who in the congregation might possibly be one
Now,
of them.
how would that bring it out?
Well, by what, if you really yourself were a solid Jew, you could say it, but if you were really kind of a believer in the Messiah, you wouldn't want to say those words because they're
Was everybody required to repeat it out loud, or?
Well,
What?
everybody would say amen. There was a whole series of them. I think there were 17, and then the new one made it 18.
Okay.
And everybody at the end of each one would say, amen.
So if you were one of those heretics, you'd probably not say a real loud amen. You'd go,
Or on any day that you attended the synagogue,
Yeah.
you could be asked by the synagogue leader to say that prayer, to say that series of benedictions
Okay.
that day. Well, how could you do it? How could you do that one? Would you skip it? If you skipped it,
You identify
you
yourself.
identify yourself
Yeah.
again. Yeah, so.
But now, what's interesting is that the actor who plays the priest way up there on
That's
the
right.
on the portico,
Yeah.
he knew the curse.
He knew the curse by heart.
Did you really?
He did. And
You know something?
yeah.
And he does this little sign like this when he's doing it, and we all thought, that's kind of weird,
Kind of Star
But
Trek-y.
he said that's really what they did.
They do. They
you
put
know?
the fingers like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
So they continued that in their series of benedictions there up until relatively recent times. But it was all for the purpose, Dwight, of identifying those Christians who were worshiping on Sabbath in the only church they had, which would be the
right.
the synagogue.
Yeah.
Let's go. Let's get outside the covers now. We've covered the book. Hal Holbrook does a masterful job on part 2. But Pat, Sabbath keeping is going on at the same time outside these covers in the East.
Well, remember that Jesus sent the disciples all over the world.
Yes, he did.
And according to tradition in India, they believe Thomas came down to India.
I have been to Madras where they say Thomas was a martyr. I've stood on that
Right.
very spot.
Martyred by a
chieftain.
Yeah. And, ostensibly it was a Jewish colony there, and he came to tell them about the Messiah. Everyone was waiting for the Messiah, and he came to tell them the Messiah had come. The St. Thomas Christians in their history, evidently there was a church established by Thomas, and there's some indication that they were Sabbath-keeping church for many, many years. In fact, one of our experts in part 4, a Portuguese man, told us that there's to this day a group that split off from those St. Thomas Christians in southern India who keep the Sabbath.
In India to this
In
day?
India to this
Is
day.
that right?
They don't live in that same region. They live to the north, but he says that they continue to keep the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Now, it's
And-
just a stone's throw geographically, as it were, to China.
According to tradition, Thomas went not only to India but to China and established Christianity early in China. We don't have
See,
any.
that's a new one to me because I had not heard that Thomas went to China.
Yeah, we don't have any way to substantiate it. And of course, we can't really find anything written about Thomas going to India
Sure.
either, but it's certainly accepted in India that he did. And, other writings all concur that the Sabbath was kept at least for the first 300 years all over the Eastern world. And the Church of the East even many years beyond that, you find references to the Sabbath here and there in their writings. The Coptic Church in Egypt kept the Sabbath probably until the 5th century, and to this day it's still in their creeds. So, it's very common that disciples went out and they took with them
Sure.
the religion of Jesus.
But you say Coptic, it's a good segue to Ethiopia. Because we all know the story about the eunuch, Philip, Acts 8.
Right.
So, Sabbath is being kept in Ethiopia right on through the centuries?
Well, it appears that the story of Philip and the eunuch may be a separate story.
Not connected.
Not connected. The Ethiopian tradition now is that Christianity came to Ethiopia really in the 4th century. But as far as...
There's a fascinating story to the 4th or 5th century
yeah, that's right.
entrance.
The two brothers, Pat.
Yeah, Edesius and Fermentius were two brothers who were on a ship with their uncle, and either pirates got it or it shipwrecked or something, and they ended up, being found on the land there in Abyssinia. They were taken to the court of the king, and the king immediately, they found favor in his sight, and he put them in important positions. One became a secretary. One of them became a tutor for his son. The king died. The queen, invited the men to stay, and eventually Fermentius then went back to Egypt and asked for them to send a church leader for Ethiopia, because he had taught them the gospel all these years that he had been there, and they were ready now to have a bishopric there. So that's the story. And the Syrian Christians, they were Syrian men, were a Sabbath-keeping church at that time, as were the Copts.
So you're thinking that the two young boys, or the two sons, growing up, were Sabbatarians, and they brought the Sabbath to Ethiopia at that time.
And there's another connection, because in Abyssinia, they trace their knowledge of God back to Solomon.
Really?
They don't trace it to Philip. They trace it to Solomon. And in Ethiopia, supposedly they had a reproduction of the Ark of the Covenant and a temple laid out similarly to what the Hebrews used. And so they consider Solomon to have been their introduction to the Creator God. So maybe they had the Sabbath already. They might have had knowledge of the Sabbath already.
It's very possible that if they didn't have it at that time, that these two young Syrians could have brought the knowledge of the Sabbath. Now,
Fermentius, by the way, went back. He was when he said, you ought to send a bishop to Ethiopia, the Coptic leader said, sure, we'll send a bishop, you. And they sent him back, so he became the first bishop of the Ethiopian church.
And it's interesting.
And it's Sabbatarian from that point on?
Off and on. But before we get to that, the king's son, Izana, became the next king after he died there in Ethiopia. And there are some brass plates that tell of his exploits. And it's interesting that the first 4 of them attribute his successes to basically animist-type gods, but the 5th one, he attributes his success to the Creator God.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh.
So at some point in there, he was converted.
And the Creator God would suggest maybe he would recognize the day of the Creator God, the Sabbath.
It's quite likely.
The earliest evidence, and again, we're talking now not about tradition, but the earliest written or documented evidence that we have about Sabbath keeping in Ethiopia comes from probably the 6th century, where in the written liturgy there is included this clear reference to the Sabbath and the 7th day. And so scholars recognize this to be the first documented evidence of the 7th-day Sabbath.
In the 500s AD.
And of course, they had translated the Bible into their own language by that time.
They had.
In Ethiopia.
But now, if you go a little further into the story of Ethiopia, you do find that there is not an unbroken line of Sabbath keeping in Ethiopia, because in the late 1200s, 13th century, here is this monk that the Ethiopians call Eustathios, Eustathius in Latin, and he forms a whole order of monks. There's actually 2 primary orders of monks in Ethiopia. He establishes one of these orders of monks. One of the keystones of his ministry is the restoration of the Sabbath. And finally, in 1450, the Ethiopian emperor at that point calls a church council. At this church council, the Sabbath is reestablished as part of Ethiopian worship. Now, that is not Sabbath to the exclusion of Sunday. That is Sabbath in addition to Sunday. So that was restored then. And so there obviously had been a break. And there's evidence now, still today, that Sabbath and Sunday are kept together, kind of as dual Sabbaths in Ethiopia.
And let's talk about Sabbath and Sunday together a little bit. The Coptic Church was a Sabbath-keeping church. But Rome and Alexandria were the two places that kept a Sunday holy day right from the get-go. The Sabbath went with the apostles everywhere they went, except Rome and Alexandria, who had maintained some paganism. And in Alexandria, some of the church fathers really believed that we can't possibly win our pagan neighbors unless we mix a little paganism in with Christianity to make it more attractive.
But this would be in the 2nd century.
Right, this is 2nd century. So in Egypt, while the Coptic Church was a Sabbath-keeping church, they were under a lot of pressure. And so
Kind of a
it
dual.
was Sabbath and Sunday both, and eventually then Sunday became predominant and Sabbath kind of fell by the wayside.
I just have to take a moment here before we say goodbye to part 2. Isn't it amazing? I mean, does it strike you as just one of those awesome realizations that there is a supernatural preservation of the sanctity of the 7th day that just penetrates the human race? Because we tend to think, well, let's see, it was with Jesus and Paul, then it just kind of got blown out of the water, and somebody came along in the 1800s and rediscovered it, and hallelujah. But here you have chronicled historically a thread that was not severed ever on this planet. You care to respond to that at all before we say goodbye?
That really does amaze me, because I grew up in a Sabbatarian church, my whole life. And for some reason, I thought we started in the 1800s. And as we researched this, and I could see that, a lot of the issues in this world, like the schism between the Greek and the Latin church, had to do with Sabbath. And I was never taught that. It just amazed me to see that, we really are a little piece of a very large church. We aren't unique down here.
I have almost an opposite reaction.
Really?
Only because I had, prior to working on this project, I had an indistinct idea that somewhere there was an unbroken, kind of an organic line of Sabbath keepers, And I have learned in research for this that you cannot really trace it quite that directly. There have always been Sabbath keepers. But
somewhere on the planet.
Yes, but whether you could find
Father to Son,
and on down, that's a much different question. But certainly, as you say, the Lord has miraculously preserved the Sabbath in one place or another. And maybe, maybe some of these accounts are like little jewels that have been hidden in the earth, but they are there, and we do find them.
Well, and as one place wanes, another place, grows, and it's like, God sees someone's losing it, so He raises someone else up here with it.
Hallelujah. One of the great surprises, and when we come back I want to get to this, is the surprise of St. Patrick as he's come to be known. An incredible story there. And I want to plunge into that with part 3.